Oh, shit. This one goes out to a new UFC champion that is usually feeling higher than the ceiling and has me feeling gifted, financially speaking. Ooh, it's the ultimate feeling. How you get so fly, so fly, so fly, so fly. Sugar show how you get so fly. Oh my goodness. Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC Singapore. What a night UFC 292 was for Sean O'Malley and MMA Rax. And if you don't believe me when I say I'm up 292 units since UFC Charlotte, I don't give a fuck. Because if you've been tailing, then you understand what a ride it's been. And if you're a doubter, you can get absolutely fucked. Like a certain police officer that wants to keep talking shit and carrying a flame for Kurt Hollabaugh, who is now a tough winner. Good for him. But I don't really care about that relative to all the other success that we had at UFC 292. And we're going to get into it. But I will account for my loss and then get into the UFC Singapore picks. I won't really need to speak on the drama so much that unfolded in the aftermath. If you were privy to that mess on Twitter, I think I was speaking from a pretty righteous position. And that was reflected in the fact that I took about 100 followers off of the certain retired police officer that I was beefing with, who has previously gone 4 for 24 on a UFC event, which if I ever do something like that, please insert my head into a wood chipper. Even as I put these out for free, I would never, ever do something like that to my loyal following, even the ones that remember UFC Long Island last year. We're going to get into that. Not UFC Long Island. I don't want to reflect on one of the worst events of my life on what is such a beautiful, blossoming weekend for the brand. They're coming off of one at least and hopefully rolling into another one. It is Thursday morning at about 10 o'clock as I'm recording this. And I have about 11 fights to get into, I believe. This is quite a packed card. I saw some people saying, oh, it's not so good, and like it's lame that the main event is lined as a minus 800, and it sure is, but I have some thoughts on the main event. It's going to be an emotional one. Not really so much for betting. It was the first main event that I've considered putting out a stay away for, which I feel is not true to the spirit of this game. I feel like everybody should put out at least a pick or a side of some sort for the main event, which is why when I'm conflicted, I often choose to hedge on rounds in the over direction, and I've seen that pay off quite a bit. I think it's going to in this case, again this evening, but I don't expect to be including this as a leg in any parlays given even the value on the rounds for Max Holloway and the Korean Zombie is quite scarce. So we'll speak on that. The recent and long-term events in terms of not only the careers but surroundings of each of those fighters is something that I think merits a lot of meditation on, and I look forward to speaking to the perspective of both sides in that case and what watching each of those fighters as I've tried to build up my own brand in this space, what each side has meant to me on this journey. So I look forward to speaking on that. Obviously, I timestamp everything, so if you're looking forward to that as opposed to a discussion of Yarno Erin's and Sungwoo Choi, then go right ahead and do that. Before I get to the charming Korean and the young buck from Holland, trying to find some nice things to say about these openers on the prelims. But speaking of prelim fights, I need to address my one error with regards to favorites missing last week, which was Mr. Austin Hubbard, and I dedicated like 15 minutes to that stupid tough fight that I said, oh, this is a dumb thing to the worst finale to the worst tough season ever, and then I chose the wrong side in both cases. Although I as I said, I was touch and go with the prelims last week. I did watch the main event with a few of the people that I was in the bachelor party with, and we exclaimed quite loudly when Sugar Show won. But because I was doing other party activities throughout the day of various natures, I couldn't watch any of the prelims really. To be honest, I did take a few glimpses at the Petrosky-Mearshart fight just to see if I was going to go out in the early stages, and thankfully the judges not named Sal D'Amato looked favorably upon Mr. Andre, so that was nice. But Mr. Hubbard was not so fortunate, although I did look up the scorecards and saw, while I was watching the fight, to see how he lost, and I did see that the judges unanimously gave Hubbard a 10-9 in the first, in spite of the fact that some people perceive that Holloway may have gotten some late damage off in the end of the round. The judges looked favorably upon the well-rounded performance that Hubbard gave through the first 5 minutes and gave him a 10-9 in accordingly unanimous fashion. So I felt good about my read watching that first 5 minutes. I saw that Hubbard lost while just checking the results on Saturday, so I was going to be curious to see how he lost by submission. What was interesting was to see Holloway come out with a sense of urgency in the second round, and it wasn't just merely some weird exchange in which Hubbard did one of those trap takedowns and ended up conceding bad position, as I figured might have happened. He genuinely got caught by Holloway, who was throwing volume combinations against the fence to open the second, recognizing he needed to come out and make a statement, or at least earn some respect back. He got it back. He got great position, and Hubbard made a few submission mistakes, which you can't necessarily assume is going to happen when a fighter has never been finished. But in this case, you still knew the submission upside was going to be with Holloway just because he had more offensive attempts represented through the stats in his previous UFC performances than what Hubbard did through his own previous run with the promotion. So the lesson here, as we saw Hubbard transition and make mistakes into, I believe, an arm bar and then a triangle choke. Ultimately, that's what he tapped to, despite the fact that Holloway was on his back and did concede position to transition into those. If Hubbard had a bit more discipline in terms of those, I'm sure he was probably, upset at himself for how he lost that, given that he did outright win the first round and demonstrated that he was going to have a more well-rounded skill set. And not only that, but had the tools to keep the volume striking at bay for Holloway, such as you saw the push kick that he liked to go to, that he demonstrated a lot in his previous UFC run. That was one of the reasons that he also won his tough semifinal, and it's how he dragged so many of these fights to decision, is because he could just freely deploy it up the middle so often. Because he wouldn't try to target the face, he just often just goes for the chest, and it's often just a way to keep fighters at bay. It was a good weapon that he used, and it was something he deployed in the first round against Holloway, and it was something that kept Holloway a little bit stalled out, which was something he had displayed in some of his previous performances, including the tough semifinal that he even won. So the finishing upside was with Holloway, and it obviously was not with Hubbard not only because of the submission volume that I alluded to, but also because of the volume in the striking discrepancy that was illustrated in the stats, as well as Holloway very recently had one punch lights out finishes on his resume that Hubbard simply didn't have. So in cases where going forward you have a title fight where the underdog has all of the finishing upside, which is illustrated not only through the numbers in the striking for the volume, but also their power, and you factor in the submissions on top of that, regardless of what your grade on the favorite is, you need to just throw that out in this case. So that'll be something that I look for in the future for a major UFC title fight. I'm not necessarily upset in this case that I blew a favorite pick on a low-level MMA fight like that. Although, I will say that I was talking about making it a leg last week, and the abundance of pushback that I got made me hedge off on that. So I'm proud of myself that I did in that case. But to the credit of the people that gave me shit, had that not happened, I perhaps would have ended up making that a leg and blown what would have otherwise been a really nice weekend. So it did work out ultimately. Credit to the people that preach skepticism to me without getting necessarily violent. People like Pepe Silvia, I was very appreciative that he merely asked me to elaborate on my opinion, which I did. He didn't return fire. He didn't insult my perspective. He merely asked me to elaborate on it. That's the standard I think we should look for in terms of communication about this kind of stuff. I saw somebody say something like, "What happened to the days when we would just settle it on with a fist fight? These MMA Twitter characters. These parlay donkeys." Shut up, you fucking meathead. All right. Anyway, that's enough about UFC 292. You saw how good of a weekend it was. It clinched profitability for me for the year, which is why I was feeling myself in that introduction. But we got another event to get to, and we got 11 fights to talk about. I'm going to try not to meditate on too many of these. But I will say this is I'm not just saying this because of the run that we've been on, but just from in terms of like a grading the abundance of fights available. I've been throwing out so many, and a lot of the cards have been kind of like skimmy that I haven't gotten as many spots as I would like on a lot of these, particularly Apex events. Like, it's cool that I got a clean sheet on Vegas 76, but I did only put out 6 picks for that. What I really like are these road shows where you typically see a lot of fights. And in this case, even though this is UFC Singapore, there's 11 fights here, and I've only got a no pick on one of them. I've got 10 different bets I can play with here, and a lot of them are underdog spots. And so if I get a 3-leg parlay that I feel good about, there's just dogs I can attach to the end of all of those. And if you get even one of those to hit on top of the 3-leg, you have a great day. You get 2 of those, that's an awesome day. Anything better than that is just, gravy. I mean, it is from even just one of them, but I mean, it's why days like this can be fun with this strategy. So we're going to get into all of it. I look forward to it. And the first fight is going to be Sungwoo Choi and Jarno Erin. So I believe I put out a stay away for Sungwoo Choi's last fight with Trizano. And I graded Michael Trizano to win, but his performance against Lucas Almeida, in which I graded him to win and played him as such, and he was a favorite, was very disappointing. I think Trizano's cut from the UFC, it's one of the reasons I felt comfortable talking so much shit about Tough last week. That is a guy that the UFC did not want to let go but was just not good. And the longer that they let him hang around and get finished by guys like Lucas Almeida and cough up decisions elsewhere, the worse it was going to reflect on the promotion that they sank all of these resources into him. That's why it was so shocking that when he beat Sungwoo Choi in the fashion that he did, in a fight that is remembered very, very fondly by fans, but has been somewhat shut out in the memory of the UFC, there was a double knockdown. I mean, you never see that at this level. It was so incredible. One of the best. It was a competitor with Gaethje Oliveira for the best one-round fight of last year. And Choi just didn't come out on the winning end of it. But the crazy thing is Choi got to keep his job. And Trizano got let go without a contract renewal, partially because he missed weight. But I think that kind of speaks to how desperate the UFC is for Korean stars. You already saw that with Duhoi Choi. Forgive me. I bet on him. I should remember his name. But he didn't win his fight. He drew with fucking Kyle Nelson, my new nemesis in this betting space. But the UFC needs Korean stars, especially because they're about to lose Zombie, which, we're going to talk about later. But they were, I think, a little bit optimistic that Choi would kind of ride the momentum of that Julian Erosa win to something better, and it just hasn't happened. Now we're at the stage where they're running road to the UFC and they're trying to beef up these prospects, and they're hopefully going to be able to do that with Rinya Nakamura, and they're hoping to get some stuff or salvage some other performances from guys they were once optimistic about, perhaps even compared to Conor McGregor in a certain sense, like Yusaku Kinoshita. But it's interesting that they're giving Sungwoo Choi on such a losing streak in which he's been finished multiple times another shot at proving himself, and they didn't give the same grace to a tough winner that they didn't see as much potential in. So with his career momentum, you can't feel good about it, particularly with the kind of style fighter that he is, opposite what his opponent is offering, in spite of Choi's UFC experience, by contrast. Erin's took the fight with Gomez with William Gomez, his UFC debut, on short notice, I believe within about a week. If you listen to the show that Adam Martin does, the MMA Oddsbreaker podcast with Marcel Dorf. Marcel is from Holland himself and lives about 30 minutes away from Erin's, and he spoke to how Erin's took the fight on a week's notice when he was just kind of eating and drinking regularly and had to put the brakes on it, and said, I got to make weight. So he went out to Paris on short notice and took the third round away from Gomez, who since went on to beat Francis Marshall. So the guy has a little bit of ability. He now has had a longer runway in which to prepare for the fight more appropriately. And his regional tape, he does have a one punch lights out knockout. It's a right hand and he puts the guy out on his feet and the guy just kind of slowly falls back. It's interesting because usually in terms of grading that as just like a baseline, I'll look to what Sherdog says about how the fight was finished on a fighter's profile, and they will usually be pretty accurate in terms of illustrating whether a fight was ended by one punch or not. In cases where I see a fighter has it multiple times, I usually don't even bother looking up what how they did it. But in this case, I wanted to ensure that he actually did have a one-punch lights-out finish, and the tape definitely illustrated that. So you can look it up for yourself if you're so inclined to see that level of violence. But Erin's also, through the Gomez result, displayed that he's going to have the edge and submission ability in this matchup. And Choi is someone that has lost by submission previously. So if this fight does hit the ground, I would expect Erin's to have the more offensive tools available in terms of finishing the fight, especially as the fight gets into the second and third rounds if it does get out of the first. I think Choi is going to have the overall striking advantage, but the fact that Erin's has that ability to hurt him with the counter, Choi coming forward is only going to, in his hit ability with that strategy, is only going to expose him to damage that even a guy like Trizano has proven he can use to knock Choi down multiple times in the first round. So I do think that even though this is a very close matchup, because I would expect Choi to be just a little bit more disciplined because of his experience and because he does have the striking edge, and I expect most of this fight to take place on the feet, I think Erin's has enough tools available to do damage on the feet in response in a way that provides a bit of an equalizer. And if the fight does go to the ground, I think that a club and sub is extremely live here for Erin's. So I'm edging ever so slightly towards Erin's in this case. And because it feels like a very, very live card for dogs, in my opinion, I'm going to roll with him here. If I did a little bit more tape work for each of these sides, it's possible that my opinion would shift. But I do remember from what I saw in Choi's performance against Trizano that just cannot inspire confidence. That he got knocked out in the first round by an opponent that the UFC had a promotional stake in, that they have since released from the promotion, no longer on the roster, in spite of the fact that he didn't compete again since getting that first round knockout. How many fighters get cut after a first round finish like that? Very bizarre. So I understand why Choi's the favorite here, but I'm gonna be optimistic that Erin's proves he belongs with a full camp and a less grueling weight cut and a more professional approach, despite the fact that he's fighting further from home, a continent away. So give me Jarno Erin's to pull off the upset to open the evening. The next fight is Yusaku Kinoshita and Billy Goff. As I said in the previous segment, it's quite amusing that this person, Yusaku Kinoshita, who's now 6-2, was compared to Conor McGregor of all people prior to getting knocked out by Adam Fuckett, who has since been bulldozed by Mike Mallow, albeit in what was clearly a Canadian setup. It is interesting that this is the next opponent they have for him here, and they've kept him on the shelf for this long. I do think he's kind of front-running a bit here, just because this is a guy who hasn't been to decision and is coming off of a first-round knockout loss to what was a step up in competition for him. Goff is a guy who has much better career momentum, and in spite of the fact that he's been knocked down multiple times on this run, he is a guy that has risen to the occasion and gotten finishes in every instance. And he is someone that has better experience going into the later stages of fights. He is a guy that surprisingly has 5-round experience, even in spite of the fact that it was a loss. But he did go 3 rounds on Bellator in a unanimous decision. He also got a 3-round win 2 years ago in the middle of what is now a 6-fight win streak for him. So he hasn't fought in a year. But in light of the fact that he did get knocked down multiple times during that run, you like he's taken some time off to sharpen his skills and perhaps maybe up his defensive game a little bit. That would be a good thing to complement the volume that he's demonstrated. But he's got the better momentum here than Kinoshita, who already proved in the last spot that he was a bit of a front runner. Now, he did have a win on Contender Series with a finish that was nice, but the experience here is just not what you would want it to be. And this is going to be his first pro fight in over a year in front of fans. Goff, I probably is on the same timeline as well, so this is a big thing for him too. But even though Kinoshita has the edge here relative to ring rust, you can't feel good about betting him as a favorite based on the fact that he hasn't ever gone to a decision in his career. He's lost by DQ previously. So you have to factor in the risk of him committing fouls as an inexperienced 23-year-old fighter. And he most recently got knocked out by a guy named Fuckett. Until Kinoshita can prove himself on a stage like this, I don't feel comfortable betting him as a favorite. Not against a guy that has won 6 fights in a row and is going to have the perceived edge in volume and is more experienced going the distance demonstrably than the favorite is. So between Erin's and Goff as underdogs, I feel much more confident in Goff, but I am picking Goff outright to win. I don't know if he'll get it done by finish, as has been illustrated can happen if you drag Kinoshita into deeper waters and survive the initial outlash. But Goff is the more experienced fighter in spite of the ring rust, and I think that'll be reflected if this fight gets out beyond the first 5 minutes. But it's possible we get a big-time war in the opening round and Kinoshita catches him. I think that's probably the biggest reason that people are siding with him, because they expect that. But at the end of the day, there's too many other ways for Goff to win this based on what he's demonstrated he can do previously in MMA than what Kinoshita has, in spite of the flashy finishes, albeit at places like Pancrase and Ryzen. And deep Osaka Impact. Give me Billy Goff. Very popular underdog this week, and I'll ride with him as well. And the next fight will be Rolando Bedoya and Song Kenan. This is a very inappropriate line. It's interesting because this is a bit of a common trend that I'm seeing now with fighters that debut on short notice against bigger names that are able to drag things out to a split decision of sorts, for some reason end up being lofty favorites over guys that have fought higher level competition in the UFC but haven't necessarily found success. The most prominent example that sticks out to me from earlier this year would be the Santos fellow that fought Lerone Murphy and then was favored over David Onama and promptly got submitted. I believe his name might have been Daniel Santos. I can't remember, but he was pretty heavily favored at, I think, like 2-1 over Onama. I believe that he even won the first round over Onama, but then Onama turned it up in the second round and finished him. So there were plenty of people that were happy and cashed on that ticket. I preached stay away. And I'm seeing a similar pattern here in this fight relative to Rolando Bedoya. He's being valued in the 300 range because he is perceived to have been robbed against Chaos Williams. Now, to Bedoya's credit, he's never been finished, and he's fighting a fighter in Song Kenan with far more attrition. not only career-wise but also recently. We all saw Kenan tragically fumble away what would have been a hilarious knockout of Ian Gary in his last performance and ultimately fade over the final 10 minutes and get finished in the last one. I spoke on it a bit last week, but as someone that had the -2.5 under on the Gary Kenan fight, you can only imagine how devastating that was for me publicly. But we've bounced back a bit since and are profitable for the rest of the year and playing with house money. But I'll still try to get you guys some returns because I'm nice about it. Anyway, Bedoya, I think that he's probably going to drag this one out to decision too. He's gone to one in 4 of his last 6 fights. He had a big streak of decisions to start his career, so it is something that has been foundationally comfortable for him, is just to kind of lean on his chin against people that aren't really able to take advantage of it. So Kenan would be wise to start fast. He was able to find a good counter against Gary and find his chin, but we don't see the same damage tolerance from Gary that we do from Bedoya. So I don't know if he's actually going to be able to find it in the first round. And as the fight wears on, I think it's just going to be less likely for him to find a finish. And I think it is possible that Bedoya, if he does get that 15 minutes of striking, is able to find a window where he can put Kenan away. But Kenan has also demonstrated that he's more experienced overall at the UFC level. He may not mix it up in this fight, but if he does and he's successful against a guy that we didn't necessarily see have that deployed against him in Chaos Williams, it's possible that Kenan is able to find some surprise success in a way that makes you regret betting Bedoya at the value that you did while the fight is happening. So I don't want to invite that risk. I do have Bedoya graded to win, but it's very slight. It's hardly even in the range where I would consider betting him in the hundreds, given the other options available. But at 300 as a favorite, with his only UFC appearance being a split decision loss, get the fuck out of here. No way. Don't bet this shit. There's too many other good fights on this card, so just skip it. The next fight that I'm going to talk about is... Oh my, this is very, very important. So buckle up, kiddos, because this is not only a pick'em, but this is a ride or die for MMA Rax all of a sudden. It is Michal, Oleksiejczuk, and Chidi and Njokuani. All right, if you've been following on Twitter, this is kind of an interesting turn of events. So let me recap things for you. Last week's RAXPOD got 3,000 views on Twitter, which is kind of insane given how many that's of this morning, by the way, Thursday morning. So about a week after it goes up. So 3,000 views in a week, that's pretty good. I guess people want to say, oh, did this guy really pick O'Malley? And then they heard my read on it, and they're like, wow, he was kind of totally on point. But, you know, it floated around the Twitter space a bit more than it did on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, by the way. I would greatly appreciate it. And make sure to like and retweet on, repost on X. We're still calling it Twitter. Quick aside, I'm from Chicago, so I grapple with the dilemma of calling the Sears Tower the Willis Tower, and I see that many people still call it Sears, but the out-of-towners call it Willis with no problem. So while the Twitter loyalists have trouble making that gravitation to X, I expect that people that don't really care about that kind of brand loyalty are going to, in the long term, embrace X in a way that Musk is going to win with that rebrand. That's just my opinion, but I will still continue to call it Twitter because that's what I'm used to, and I don't want to confuse people. But the RAXPOD got 3,000 views on Twitter last week. So it floated around a bit. I don't know if a certain Polish UFC fighter may have heard any opinions, but I do know that the brand made enough of an impression on the guy that when he saw his name displayed in a betting pick for it this week against Mr. Chidi and Njokuani, Mr. Michal Oleksiejczuk threw me a favorite on the pick, which I'm very grateful for. It's not the first time that a fighter is engaged with the brand. That was actually, you may recall, when I put out a pick for Muhammad Makayev last year. He actually liked the under that I put out for his fight against, I believe it was Malcolm Gordon. And unfortunately, he didn't end up getting the finish until the third round, but I was still grateful that Makayev showed me some love in what was the infancy stage for MMA Rax. The funny thing is, there's actually another fighter on this card that has engaged with the brand previously as well. So I'm not going to say it right now, but I'd be curious if any of you are privy enough to know who it is. I will reveal them later when I talk about their fight. But getting back to Mr. Michal Oleksiejczuk, I saw that he favorited it, and I wanted to call attention to the fact that he did that, because I think it's funny that a fighter, particularly in the weird stage that the UFC is in with gambling, I think it's interesting that as they're being investigated for, whatever's going to go on with Krause and that he did get let go, that they're letting these like gambling journalists kind of interview the fighters still. You don't really see it as much with the UFC, but at the lower promotions like PFL, you've seen a lot of cappers that try to do the journalism thing, which I can respect because I'm, somebody that has done the quasi-journalism thing myself in the football space. I have technically covered press conferences for names such as Jim Harbaugh and James Franklin and many other acclaimed coaches throughout the Big Ten in college football. But I digress. I don't want to, give too much of the mystery away. I'll do a face reveal at 100,000 YouTube subs. How about that? Anyway, Michal Oleksiejczuk saw that I wished him luck in this post in which I, shouted him out in the community and said, thank you. I appreciate the good wishes. And I thought that was kind of the end of it. And, it was cool that, it was like, oh, this guy is so confident in himself that he's even, confident that I'm deploying him, even considering him as a leg, if we're being honest, given the value that I think he's at. But then something interesting happened. Michal Oleksiejczuk put out his corner tweet. And he tagged MMA Rax in it. You can go look at it yourself if you don't believe me and click on the 9 people he tagged in it. There were a few different brands that he put in there, and one of them was MMA Rax. Now, most people aren't going to see that because most people don't click on the people that are tagged in those things, but the data for Twitter picks up that I'm tagged in that. And not only that, Oleksiejczuk had to go out of his way to tag me in his corner tweet. So all of a sudden, I feel obligated. I feel spiritually in the corner of Mr. Oleksiejczuk this weekend. And I not only lend you my betting perspective, you proud son of Poland, but I will also give you my spirit in your corner as you face the formidable Chidi and Njokuani. And what is a big fight for both of these guys? I think perhaps it is for Chidi a little bit more, and that's why I'm a little bit concerned relative to Michal. But I'll get into that. But I just wanted to clarify before I get into the analysis that I did do an unbiased analysis prior to a fighter quite literally putting me in their corner this weekend without me asking them to do such, merely just through being a nice guy on Twitter, which I usually am. And I wonder how many other cappers have that badge on their resume in terms of engaging organically with the UFC, as opposed to going and grabbing a press pass and saying, hey, I'm here, let me ask you some invasive questions after you've just committed legal violence for as much as 15 minutes. Good luck, Mr. Oleksiejczuk, this weekend. But the reason I think that he's going to win is he's proven to be a bit more well-rounded. He's got double the UFC experience. He's 6 years younger, and we know how the age gap usually lends itself to betting success in this sport. Further than that, people talk about how Oleksiejczuk struggled against Jacoby and how they think that is going to be a pattern that translates into what Njokuani could do. But I would caution people that I believe that fight was at 205 pounds, and this is going to be a middleweight, so Oleksiejczuk should be more mobile than what he had available against a much beefier, bigger, threatening, like, potential to hurt you guy in Jacoby. We just saw Jacoby put away Kennedy and Chekwu in the first round, and Oleksiejczuk was able to drag that out over 15 minutes by contrast. Jacoby also in the post-fight interview spoke about how he took that fight a little bit injured with respect to not being able to deploy kicks, which for a former kickboxing great like him, it's obviously an important part of your tool set, and he was still able to get a unanimous decision. So Oleksiejczuk, fighting Njokuani, Njokuani is a guy that relies far more on kicks in order to have his success. He has a bit of the similar striking problem I described with Aljamain Sterling last week, in that he'll deploy the kick, but he doesn't use it to set up like a 1-2 combo or string anything. He's doing a lot of 1-2s where it's like one kick and then one strike after it, or just throwing 1-2s. The volume isn't there for the finishing success consistently you want to see, even though he has threatening kicks. And he also has, obviously, threatening elbows. Just a good overall Muay Thai set. But the more well-rounded martial artist that will be able to know how to counter that is Oleksiejczuk, and a guy that fights at a higher pace. And when Njokuani deploys these kicks, as Jacoby didn't, which is one of the reasons I believe why Oleksiejczuk was never to get all the way into the pocket as he perhaps would have wanted against a kickboxer that leans on that kind of outside striking. As Oleksiejczuk is able to evade kicks that we saw Duraev was able to mitigate Njokuani's success in a way that even Albert Duraev was able to get ahead on strikes, despite the fact that he only had about 4 minutes of control time in that split decision win. We've seen Njokuani stall out in a way that is concerning when he's not having the immediate striking success that lends itself to a finish. There's also this weird narrative, I think, that Njokuani is better on the ground than Oleksiejczuk in this fight. Njokuani, his biggest thing that has been holding him back in the UFC is that he's terrified of the ground. It was the same thing that was holding him back in the earlier stages of his career. He was not in a good position against Dusko Todorovic, but was ultimately able to stand up and land a counter elbow that put Todorovic out. But part of the reason he stalled out against Duraev was because he was so terrified of getting taken down and submitted, even though Duraev didn't really present a super terrifying submission threat. And even in the times where the fight did hit the ground and he was able to advance position, he never ultimately got it to a point where it could be finished. But the threat after the takedown threat had been established firmly, Njokuani didn't really want to throw kicks consistently or strikes that were really going to do huge damage in a way that was going to make him vulnerable to takedown attempts. And with a fight, and it's understandable why, because he didn't feel comfortable throwing more sophisticated combinations, chaining if a kick misses, chaining like an uppercut or something off of it as the entry comes. I'm not a fighter. I don't know what could be a good apt description of what would be a creative combo in that instance. But you at least like to see fighters chaining their strikes in a greater volume than what we do see from Njokuani, despite his potential to do damage. So I think Oleksiejczuk is going to be able to get in on him in the pocket and land combos. I think that as that is established, he's going to have a takedown threat available, and he should take advantage of that. So if this fight does go to the ground, I think Oleksiejczuk is in a favorable position to not only take advantage of Njokuani being a bit, not necessarily a napper, but someone that doesn't do enough from his back in a confident fashion that makes you feel good about his potential to do well from down there. You compare that to how Oleksiejczuk finished Cody Brundage, in which he was able to evade Brundage's guard to get a grounded pound finish in the first round. And that is a guy that is primarily known to be an offensive wrestler for most of his success. He put him in a compromising defensive ground position and took advantage of a guy that should have probably looked a little bit more experienced in that instance. Did play the under on that fight myself and felt very good about calling that. Made it a leg even that night, but I believe it was spoiled by Mr. Jake Matthews, which I've spoken on previously. So I do expect Mr. Oleksiejczuk to emerge victorious here if this is a well-rounded bout. Even if this is a striking battle, if this doesn't get ended in the first 5 minutes by Njokuani, which is certainly possible, even though Oleksiejczuk has only been knocked out once in his MMA career, and that was in 2014, it did happen in the first 2.5 minutes. So this is a guy who has been hurt previously and could potentially lose in that fashion early on. But his finishes in the UFC, whether it's Caio Borralho or Jimmy Crute or Ovince St. Preux, all submissions. And that is not something that we have seen as a credible threat from Njokuani in a very, very long time. And in that case, he won the fight by guillotine. And I believe it was in the year 2010. So 13 years ago by guillotine, and I just don't think that we can feel confident that Njokuani is going to get a UFC level submission, especially given we did see him get rear naked choked in Bellator in his penultimate appearance. So we haven't seen Oleksiejczuk win by submission himself since 2016, but if that fight somehow does go to the ground for some reason, you still have to feel more confident that he would deploy that offensive skill set as he has demonstrated it more recently in a way that Njokuani has previously lost more recently than what Njokuani has demonstrated he has available through guillotine. So perhaps if Oleksiejczuk, with not having a lot of takedown success, maybe Njokuani takes advantage of that and deploys a high elbow guillotine of some sort while still standing him up. I don't really see it, though. You're describing very specific circumstances in that case. If this does go the distance, Oleksiejczuk, I believe, is the more experienced fighter in terms of round winning percentage. I believe Njokuani has more experience going the distance outright, but I would assume that Oleksiejczuk has had more success going the distance in the UFC. Although actually that's not necessarily true. He had the no contest with Khalil Roundtree after the violation for PEDs, and he's got a split decision over Modestas Bukauskas. So maybe Chidi does have an advantage if this goes 7. I don't know, but Chidi is a guy that even when he's done a lot of damage in fights like where he fought RoboCop, he didn't necessarily have what it took to step on the gas and get the finish outright. Even though I'm someone that I picked Chidi to beat him, I thought he would do it. I was feeling very good after that cut, and then they just didn't end the fight, and RoboCop came back and just dogged him. It was fabulous, to be honest. So I couldn't necessarily be mad about that. I do think it's going to be a competitive fight. I would expect Chidi to probably even win the first round, but I think Oleksiejczuk has a bit more finishing upside here, just from a well-rounded standpoint. And I do think that if he's able to put Chidi on the ground at any point and deploy ground and pound from there, that could be an avenue to victory for him. Could also potentially see him capitalize on a mistake from Chidi, take his back, and get a rear naked choke. That would only be the second submission win of his MMA career, but this is a guy that has twice as much experience as Chidi and in the UFC, and I think is in a very good spot here to bounce back from his submission win against a rising rapidly prospect in Kyle Baralho. So I don't know what Oleksiejczuk's future is in the UFC, but he's a guy that is 28 years old, already turned 28 this year, so is not going to turn 29 until next February. And if he wins this fight, that's going to be his 12th UFC appearance, and he will have most of his wins by first round finish, even though he does have experience going the distance against good names. So I wish him all the best. I don't have the platform established yet in which I really feel comfortable doing interview requests, but Mr. Oleksiejczuk, as I alluded to my credentials earlier, I have covered press conferences before outside of this sport that are on a bit bigger of a stage than this sport even, I would say in some cases. So I would not be shy at all in doing an interview and with you or anyone else on the UFC roster for that matter, except for maybe Jamie Pickett. But I will I wish you all the best, and I thank you for tagging me in your Corner Crew tweet. And I don't know if I'm going to make you a leg because now I've got this personal stake in it that I didn't sign up for, but I'm very graciously going to accept. But I am very much considering it. So, a lot writing on this fight this week. But Mr. Michal Oleksiejczuk, I'm hopeful that you will find the finish on Chidi and Njokuani. The next fight is Garrett Armfield and Toshiomi Kazama. Okay, this is a stupid fight. So let me explain what happened last night. So I won some money on Contender Series and then basically pissed it all away on PFL, and I ordered Taco Bell before the Shane Burgos main event because I was like, okay, am I really going to chase my losses a third time tonight? And I fell asleep. So before the Taco Bell got there, and it was only like a 30-minute delivery, which is kind of embarrassing, further than the fact that I'm ordering Taco Bell and I live in Miami. But anyway, it was a night of bad decisions. Not talking about the Sadibu C one. That was the only good one in my opinion. Who likes a Carlos Leal Wallenstall? But the Taco Bell arrived promptly, and I didn't pick it up, and it sat outside of my door for I think about 5 hours. So I had 2 Baja Blasts I ordered, and a nice assortment of soft hard shell tacos. Definitely some nacho Dorito, but I have all these tacos I need to finish, and I have all these terrible fights I need to talk about. So I'm going to try to finish the tacos while talking about these shitty fights like Garrett, Armfield, and Toshiomi Kazama. But in this case, I'm on the underdog side, so at least this one's going to be a little bit fun. So let me do what I can here. And I eat this 6-hour-old Taco Bell into the microphone, which I'm sure is going to be a listening pleasure for you. But it doesn't sound any worse than it would if I was talking about Garrett, Armfield, or Toshiomi Kazama anyway, right? So, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you, but I'm going to need to take bites between talking about this shitty fight. So, Kazama got sparked when he fought Rinya Nakamura. But the interesting thing was, I did a lot of the grading for that event because I recognized that the UFC was probably going to go to the well for a lot of these guys that lost anyway, just in terms of having bodies for like Apex events and such. But it goes further than that in that they're really trying to salvage the stock of a lot of these guys. You're seeing it with Kinoshita, you're seeing it with Kazama, and you're seeing it with Nakamura as well. Although Nakamura doesn't need his stock salvaging in this case, he just needs his profile elevated, which I think is why they've conveniently put all of these guys on a card in Asia and given them spots where they have realistic shots of beating their opponents. I think that's the case here too in the Armfield-Kazama fight. This is a bit of like a pure ring rust fade if I'm being honest, but it does go further than that. Both of these guys, Armfield is the guy that I think is the favorite because he's perceived to have the overall finishing upside, especially with respect to striking power. But Kazama is also a guy that has won by one punch, lights out finish before. So we have reason to be optimistic that he can provide a bit of an equalizer in that regard. Kazama also at least won one of his previous UFC appearance, even though it was the road to the UFC one, which is, a bit technically a regional fight, but it is counted as a UFC result because I have the stats available from it in which I can build his profile. And that also includes his performance against Rinya Nakamura. But even factoring those two in, he's shown to be twice as accurate as what Armfield showed he had against David Onama, which was a short notice appearance. And I know I'm giving Erin's the benefit of the doubt with respect to a full camp and not making a debut on short notice in that. But that's also factoring in that Erin's, under those circumstances, was able to go to a decision against a perceived to be better opponent in unfriendly confines, whereas Armfield went to the Apex and got submitted by David Onama, who then lost to Nate Landwehr in his follow-up appearance, I believe. Kazama, by contrast, is fighting in friendlier confines in the same continent as Japan. And I just spoke to how the UFC has a promotional incentive to boost the profile of these road to UFC stars. In the same way that they do with, Dana White's Contender Series or the Ultimate Fighter. They want people that watch this sport to watch those shows. And what makes you want to watch those shows? Seeing guys that do well in the UFC that got their start on those shows. So you can be ahead of it and say like, oh, I remember watching this guy on Contender Series. I remember watching Jamal Hill on Contender Series. I remember watching Taila Santos on Contender Series. I remember watching Brad Katona on The Ultimate Fighter. Maybe not that one, but you pick up what I'm putting down. I remember watching Rinya Nakamura on Road to the UFC, and that's really my point. These guys that come on this show and win, they want to show that they're ready to go in terms of being a product that the UFC can offer to its viewing audience. So as they've kind of built up Road to the UFC to be a bit of Ultimate Fighter Asia, and found success with doing that. They haven't necessarily found, I think, their next star in that region yet, and I believe that's one of the reasons that they're dedicated to doing this. But the more candidates you have for stardom, the easier it is to do that. So they have an incentive here to get something out of Kazama as opposed to Armfield, who hasn't done any favors to the promotion beyond being a short notice fill-in. If he was fighting someone that didn't have any promotional stake, I would say Armfield is probably owed a favor in that case. But it's also from the same perspective, when the UFC has all the leverage, they probably feel like they don't owe Armfield any favors. So I don't know how this could get weird if it goes to decision, which it very well might. In that case, I still feel good about Kazama just because he has the tools to equalize in terms of damage and has proven to be the more accurate striker in the limited sample we have at UFC caliber competition between these two. For that reason, I think that Kazama, being the more local guy, is the value pick here, and I'm going to be taking him to beat Armfield outright. So could be a finish, could be by decision. But I think at plus 140, that's a good enough value tag on the underdog that you could just ride with that outright. So give me Toshiomi Kazama as I finish one taco and prepare to take on several more.
The next fight is
Waldo Cortes-Acosta and Lukasz Brzeski. Oh, you know I love a good sloppy heavyweight bout. I don't love it as much when the line is minus 230, 240. But I still think it's appropriate here. It's funny, I saw a certain couch potato capper putting out a pick for this fight this week that was Brzeski by decision. And it was the fight from, it was the era when Brzeski got busted for PEDs. Go watch Brzeski's appearance against Carl Williams, which I think precipitated spawned from the grueling agony of his loss to Martin Buday, in which I did feel he was rather robbed. So perhaps Brzeski feels he should be the true king of the sloppy heavyweights, but he kind of let himself go. He showed up laughably out of shape against Carl Williams, like kind of gassing in the first round. And Williams probably should have finished him, but wasn't able to do so. Just kind of dragged it out to his usual like 30-27 wrestling. But Williams was demonstrating that he had a bit more striking available that Brzeski had somewhat let go. It was not a good performance. But you feel bad for the guy because he did kind of beat Buday and he did get kind of screwed with that. So he's the punished son of the sloppy heavyweights. But Cortes-Acosta is a guy that I think is a great candidate to fight Martin Buday if he wins this fight, which I expect him to, because he's going to have the boxing edge. And even though Brzeski has displayed a bit more willingness to be well-rounded, you just know that the PED drain combined with the devastation of losing the biggest fight in his career despite winning, being so ahead on strikes. I mean, that psychologically, I can't even imagine what that does to you as a fighter when you lose a split decision like that in what is just so transparently a pure striking battle, and you land over almost over 100 more, and you're still found to have lost. It just makes you must constantly just be wondering, what do I have to do to win? Not just in that immediate sense of losing, but then when you get back in there and try to fight again and you're like, am I really, really doing enough? Because I know before that they have thought that I haven't really done it as much. And that just has to be so damaging. Cortes-Acosta isn't carrying that. Cortes-Acosta just is like, all right, if I could just make this 15 minutes of boxing on my terms, I'll win. That's just what I do. I'm a better boxer than you. I don't want the fight to be anything else other than really a glorified sparring session between heavyweights. I'm not going to ever really put you out, but I'm going to punch you a lot of times in the face, and you're not going to hit me as much, and we're just going to live with that. That's what he's demonstrated every fight outside of the Contender Series. And he hasn't fought someone with the gas tank and skill level yet to consistently deploy a wrestling game plan. We saw De Lima start to gas and abandon that in his win against Cortes-Acosta. We didn't see Brzeski have the kind of pushback or defensive wrestling tools that I think would make you feel confident about the current state that he's in, being able to take down Acosta. His avenue to victory is going to be mostly based on leg kicks. You have to imagine a fighter like Cortes-Acosta will have obviously recognized how badly that plagued him against De Lima and will have at least deployed some kind of strategy for mitigating that. And it is important to remember Cortes-Acosta did win the third round against De Lima, even after taking all that leg kick damage, and also withstanding the brief wrestling onslaught that came in the second round. So even though he mostly lost that fight due to the leg kicks, if he's able to mitigate that even a little bit against Brzeski, the striking is going to be available for him there in a way that I think he could very potentially find a finish, because this is a heavyweight bout. But because these guys have gone to decisions so many times recently, I would expect this one to be no different. In spite, I never bet on heavyweight overs. I can understand why this one would be favored to go there, though, in this case, just because the script seems kind of obvious in terms of what's going to happen. So I think you got to make Cortes-Acosta a leg this week at this value. I understand why people are cautious, because he definitely has holes in his game, but Brzeski is not a guy that is equipped to capitalize on those holes. And Cortes-Acosta has demonstrated what his favorite path to victory is several times. Brzeski largely got outstruck against Williams, which was what was so alarming relative to the drop-off from Boudet. So unfortunately, Brzeski seems like he's kind of lost it. The PED fall off is a little bit obvious. In spite of saying that, he should have been recognized with a win over Boudet, and you can understand why that has kind of psychologically devastated him as a fighter after getting caught cheating following Contender Series. So this feels like Brzeski's last fight in the UFC, regardless of how he loses it. Perhaps he's able to salvage his stock if he's able to get a flash KO or something. It is a heavyweight fight. But I don't quite tag this as a sloppy heavyweight bout. As I've said, that's had to go two ways before. And Cortes-Acosta does have polished boxing. He's not super sloppy. He just has holes in his game. I think it would be interesting to see him fight Boudet for the true title of King of the Sloppy Heavyweights. And maybe we can give Brzeski a shot at Chase Sherman on the way out. So, give me Waldo Cortes-Acosta. The next fight is Junior Tafa and Parker Porter. Oh, please tell me this is a Dorito. Oh, it's not. It's a regular hard shell. We're just grabbing at random shit here, folks. Yeah, it's not so hard, 12 hours after the fact. This is my punishment for betting on the PFL. This shit is rigged as hell, man. Don't do it. I should have just waited for the UFC. Anyway, this is an interesting fight because there's a lot of Parker Porter fans that just bet Parker Porter at the top of the week. And after thinking about it a bit further, are like, oh, shit. Look, man. it's fun rooting for a guy like that. And the thing that's super cool about Porter is that he actually has a kick-ass gas tank for what his body type is at heavyweight. It's one of the reasons why he's one of these contenders to be a cut above, the Lukasz Brzeskis of the heavyweight division. It would be interesting to see him fight Waldo Cortes-Acosta. I would think he might even be favored in that. However, he's fighting a guy that's a little bit more dangerous. He's also fighting like a guy that has the same tools as his older brother that most recently knocked out Parker Porter. And it was kind of openly illustrated after Porter's most recent win that the guy that he was fighting didn't really know what he was doing and was immediately released. So, if you got Porter at the value that you did, that was a confident bet for you. I saw a lot of people cashed on that. I think that most recent result over a guy that in Braxton Smith that was not really ready for that kind of show, it demonstrated, or it's somewhat inflated the value of Porter here in spite of the fact that he's the underdog. Now, Tafa is front-running a bit. I mean, his only UFC appearance is a lay-and-pray loss. I do believe that he got at least one of the rounds awarded to him because he was able to land more damage on Muhammad Usman. Now, the interesting thing is, I mean, if Muhammad Usman were to fight Parker Porter, how do you think that would be lined? Like, whose body type do you think is going to win in that scenario, particularly with Parker Porter at 38 years old? Smith, I believe, was in his early 30s. Tafa's much younger in this case by about 12 years, I believe. I'm not sure what the age gap was between Justin and Parker, but in most cases, I think I would try to hedge off on this, but it's very interesting that it's lined as close as it is because I bring up that Usman-Porter example because I don't expect that Porter would go at Usman with the same kind of fearlessness that Tafa did. That fearlessness was not something that we saw from, I believe it was Zach Pauga that got knocked out by Muhammad Usman. And that's important for going forward and deploying strikes, and it's how Tafa was able to steal one of the rounds, even though he got laid and prayed for about 12 minutes, and Usman really didn't do much damage to him from the bottom. But that was his fifth his fifth MMA appearance, and he was fighting a guy with a very unconventional body type. Now he's fighting someone with another unconventional body type, but in a completely opposite way. Now, Porter, if he does wrestle, is not going to gas in the same way that Usman did with trying to hold down Tafa. But Tafa, I think, is going to be able to go forward more confidently and do damage in a way that Porter's just not going to be able to contend with. So this is kind of like a pure age gap fade here, but I think that the overvaluing here is in the case of people being so happy and thrilled with how Porter's last fight went against a guy that's perceived to have a similar skill set as Tafa, if not the same level of training and ability and exposure to the high levels of the sport in the way that the Tafa family has for Australia. So that's why Tafa's even in this position to begin with, despite the fact that his record is so slim. So I am considering making Tafa a leg here just because these 10-year age gaps are so consistently hittable in terms of winners, and it is just not often that you get them at this value. And we saw Parker Porter get knocked out in the first round by this guy's brother. Like, come on. You've already seen the Porter bettors get cold feet this week. I think it was Couch Potato already hedged off so that he's only going to get like a 0.2 unit loss regardless of the result. I might have to make Tafa a leg. I'm not getting cold feet about how this fight goes from a damage perspective if it stays standing for however long Tafa's able to keep it. And I have to imagine that the Muhammad Usman fight gave him the wherewithal and experience to confidently get up against someone like Porter, who, even though isn't going to gas as much, is presumably going to have a more difficult time holding down Tafa with his physique in comparison to whatever Usman got from the pharmaceutical family that he's gratefully aligned with. I'm sorry, I meant champion bloodlines. Sorry, Mr. Kamaru. I'm just kidding. I would love to see you fight Leon Edwards a third time. Fourth time. Who remembers? Anyway, give me Junior Tafa to win first round KO. The next fight is Rinya Nakamura and Fernie Garcia. Okay, so if you had Fernie Garcia as your answer for who's the other UFC roster member that has shown MMA Rax love previously, you are correct. That was after I picked him to beat Brady Heistand, and he floored him in the first round and then didn't do it. He liked my post-fight recap in which I said he had a case for winning on damage. So, sorry you couldn't get it done, Fernie, but that's mostly on you. I don't think he's going to get it done this time either. Which is why I'm eating another taco. It was another terrible fight, and it's lined at 800, which is gross. I hate seeing it. You hate to see it, but I understand it. Now, the interesting thing is there's kind of it's just universally accepted that Nakamura is going to win this by finish because of his work lately. He's a guy that has gone to decision in one of his last 4 fights, at least, I believe. He's only fought 7 times in MMA. Now, he's definitely getting the higher level of training, but I believe Fernie is a guy that is at Fortis, if I'm not mistaken. So he's had a good level of exposure himself. And Fernie is a guy that is proven, even in the case of the Heistand fight, where he's had these discrepancies in the wrestling. He fought directly into the game plan that Heistand wanted, and he was still able to survive through most of it. Now, perhaps some of that spoke to the fact that he damaged Heistand so early, but I think that equalizer in power is something that's going to maybe perhaps cause Nakamura to be more cautious than he would otherwise if he feels that early, as Garcia doesn't immediately go away, because this is a step up in competition for Nakamura. In spite of the fact that Garcia has not really had his own UFC success further than Contender Series, this is still the best opponent Nakamura has fought. And the best opponent he has fought is a guy that very, very consistently drags these events to decision. And so because of that, I think it's not outside of the question that even though Nakamura will have whatever success that he wants, that success doesn't necessarily include a finish, or at least an early one, because Garcia's never been finished, and he's a guy that regardless of what happens is going out there to fight for 15 minutes, as his recent record of success and failures displays. So I think the hedge on rounds in a fight where the favorite is minus 800, in spite of the fact that they're obviously graded to win, it's the same thing with the main event. You don't just take the favorite because they're at that price, even if you expect them to do that. You got to look for the value elsewhere, even if you have no confidence in the underdog. My only confidence in Garcia is that he can survive for a little bit. That's more grace than most people are giving him this week. So I expect possible even 30-26 from Nakamura. But I do think that the plus 2.5 here is the play, and the value is crazy. I mean, plus 230 might be the biggest one I've ever gotten for an over in terms of putting a pick out on it. So I'll look forward to tagging this onto the end of a parlay too, in addition to the other dog plays that I have out this week. But I think this is far and away the most valuable one. So you saw Garcia survive not only some wrestling but also some submission attempts. I believe a back triangle. I think at least one rear naked choke when he was with high stand. Even if he gets put in compromising positions with Nakamura, I would expect him to at least make things difficult for him finding a finish, running the clock out, and surviving in a way that he's proven he can do against UFC level competition of Nakamura's establishment. So give me Nakamura to win. Don't bet that. If you're going to bet on this, take the over on rounds, or fight goes the distance if you want to squeak out even a little bit more value, but also more of a sweat. The nice thing here is that even if Nakamura is able to damage Garcia more than he ever has felt in a way that yields the first finish of his MMA career, you will have cashed a very, very nice plus value bet on a fight with a minus 800 favorite. So give me the over. Give me Nakamura, but only bet the over if you would. The next fight is Giga Chikadze and Alex Caceres. Now, if you know me, you know I love to fade ring rust. And so when I see that Giga Chikadze hasn't fought since I started doing this shit, I got a little concerned. And then I hear how many surgeries he's had with the injuries and whatnot. At 34 years old, outside of the prime of his career at this point. And I see that he gave up 50 44s to Calvin Kattar. I mean, none of that can inspire confidence, right? How can you feel good about any of that? Oh, I finally found a Dorito one. Let's go. I shouldn't give this fight the taco treatment, but I am going to be betting Caceres, so it is, it's kind of like the same risk as eating Taco Bell when it's been sitting out for 12 hours. You know what I mean? Oh my God. It's so good though. And it's the same feeling that you get when you bet on Caceres and then he wins by submission or meme head kick. Or he takes Daniel Pineda to a decision, but he gets knocked down in the final 15 seconds and still wins the round. The Caceres ride is crazy. That's why it's so funny that we're getting him at this price tag. I made him a leg, I believe, the night that he fought Pineda. And he completely controlled that fight. And that was a guy that really dominated Tucker Lutz in his previous appearance and has a wealth of UFC experience. I believe at least something comparable to what Chikadze has. But Caceres has nearly 3 times Chikadze's UFC experience. I believe even, well, no, not. It's possible it's more than that. But I know that it's not quite 3 times as much experience going the distance. But the guy just is, he's kind of got that same presence about him that O'Malley does in terms of, intentionally giving off the vibe that he's kind of like a crazy weirdo, but is actually kind of like a fighting savant. That is really who Caceres is, and it's reflected in the finish that he got over Arosa, which was just like one of the best head kicks of last year, if you saw it. So that is something that he has more recently done with his striking in MMA than what Giga Chikadze has offered. And his most recent offering was the complete outclassing at the hands of Calvin Kattar, who had a much less gracious 2022 afterwards. By contrast, you can see the momentum Caceres has with more experience in multiple areas with surprisingly better numbers in some areas, such as like striking defense. And that, you can say what you want about the numbers, but that's over an even more dedicated sample set than one we have from Chikadze, a guy who has a lot of fans and some nice, even recent momentum prior to the Qatar fight, but has just been out of it for a while and has been hurt a lot. And if this were lined closer, I think I could understand you feeling confident about betting him. But in the 200 range, this is just such an obscene line to me. And there's too many variables that I like with Caceres here that make me think that he's going to be the right side for this. If this goes the distance, I think Caceres has the edge. If this goes to the ground, I think Caceres has demonstrated he has a bigger submission threat available than what Chikadze does, particularly at the UFC level. And we've seen Chikadze lose by submission before. If this fight stays standing, I think that Caceres has more tools to trade at range with Chikadze than what he's being given credit for. But I can understand the concerns about Caceres' chin relative to what Chikadze has from the punching standpoint. So, in light of that, I would expect Caceres to do a better job of mitigating that weapon that Chikadze has, because he just fought somebody in Pineda that had that largely available as their best path to victory, and it wasn't a problem until the very final stages of the fight where Pineda was desperate. And in that case, Pineda was older, but he was at least carrying less ring rust in terms of understanding the urgency that you need to go win under those circumstances. I don't think that you can have that same confidence in Chikadze. That's why it's really, really surprising to me here that he's favored so highly. So I'm riding with Caceres. He's a guy that has been profitable as a favorite for me before. I'm not sure about profitable, but the night that he won, I remember making him a leg. I don't remember if the parlay hit or not. It's very possible that it did. But we're talking about UFC Singapore right now. Give me Alex Caceres to upset Giga Chikadze. I'll say it happens by submission. And when it does, it'll be like enjoying a Doritos Locos taco that's been sitting out for 12 hours, but it's comfortably in its wrap, and it does the job. And you feel good about the decision, even though you assumed a great deal of risk. The next fight is the co-main event. Oh, God. The things I do to myself. All right. I've run out of Baja Blast. I'm not going to eat any more old tacos, but I did, I think, get 3 of them down of all different varieties, a soft, a hard shell, and then a Doritos one. So I'm proud of myself that I did that. I'll finish the other ones later because, as I've said, I've run out of drink, and I don't want to break stride now that we've reached the co-main events. So I'm going to try to wrap these up, and then I'll do some more damage on the tacos. No more of... and these are fights I want to talk about, too. I don't want to just eat my way through them. They're not junk food fights, if you will. So, with that in mind, Ryan Spann and Anthony Smith. I think that the matchmaking context is always really important to consider in these high-profile matchups relative to promotional interests. Because in most cases, I would say that it is good for the UFC when they have an active fighter that is like a high level performing in a commentary role. That's not only reflected in Dominic Cruz, it's also reflected in Chito Vera, who has become a very successful member of the UFC Spanish commentary team, which I believe is one of the reasons why he was shown some promotional grace in his most recent performance against Pedro Munoz. You can acknowledge this angle of the sport if you want to or not, But between Cheeto and Batista and Petrosky last weekend, all having promotional interest relative to their opponents and all skating by on decisions, I know I feel pretty good about where I stand, and the people tailing me do too. Smith is a commentator, so you would, not quite a commentator, but is an analyst at the desk, but he's kind of caught between worlds. He's one of the guys that is on the post-fight show for even the pay-per-views and such. There was a very famous moment, I believe it was last year, late, after the events at UFC 282, where the light heavyweight title, there was a tie. Jamal Hill, I believe, was scheduled to fight Anthony Smith. Hill ended up getting a call for the title shot. Smith, who was presumed to be getting a title shot if he won that fight, was devastated to lose that opportunity, offered to help train Hill for the opportunity as a sign of good grace. You saw how that ended up playing out at UFC 283. Hill, unfortunately, has since lost the title due to his own injury. But at that point, Smith was trying to, just kind of build good karma, I think. But it showed, his devastation that he illustrated in losing that fight with Hill when he was on the post-fight commentary show at 282. It showed that he wasn't ready to give up MMA, like in terms of his title shot aspirations. Now that's interesting relative to how he performed against Johnny Walker, who's, if not a title contender, at least a rising ranked prospect. It was not competitive. It was a 30-27 decision in which Walker really showed Smith good grace by not doing any damage further than kicking out his legs. Walker wobbled him bad in the first round. Smith fell into a takedown that was able to save him a little bit. But obviously the most controversial moment of the fight came near the end of the second round when Smith was just not having anything available for Walker and began accusing Walker of being the man that infamously attacked Smith's family in the home robbery in which Smith had to fight back. So that was a bizarre moment in terms of a fighter being so gone that they need to audibly psych themselves up to bring something out of them in order to compete. And he wasn't able to do it. That's not the guy that was fighting Ryan Spann 2 years ago that was able to beat him under those circumstances. That's an important fight in terms of taping Ryan Spann even before these guys fought, because it demonstrates how there are these kind of mistakes from a guy that perhaps doesn't train as much as he should. I don't know about if at all, but you can see how there's a bit too much confidence in ability that when you go against these higher level people, they're able to capitalize on the mistakes that you make during these exchanges. The best example is the Krylov fight most recently, in which Spann opted to roll with a more experienced submission threat and promptly got caught during their ground exchanges. But those exchanges also lend themselves to what happened against his last appearance with Anthony Smith, in which he actually did get caught on the feet by a perceived to be worse striker and paid the price for it. Excuse me. I'm paying the price for that Taco Bell, or I will be soon, so I got to wrap up this show. But that win over Spann was the most recent win that Anthony Smith has had. Smith injured his leg after that in what was a non-competitive fight with Ankalaev, in which I took the over and regretted doing that. On a night in which I played, I believe, a few different light heavyweight overs and realized that wasn't the best decision relative to a plus 2.5. However, Smith, did do his survivalist routine, but it I think, really put him in a compromising state in terms of taking a lot out of him. He did have to get surgery after that one as well. And this is a guy who's just taken so much damage over the course of his career that you really just wonder if his body can keep withstanding this kind of brute force. And Spann is a guy that has to be fighting with more confidence than what he had going into the Anthony Smith fight. Spann was already a guy that had been demonstrated to be caught by mistakes on the feet, and just a fighter that was prone to mistakes generally. Ryan Spann needed a split decision to beat Sam Alvey in 2020. That means that at least one judge believed Sam Alvey beat Ryan Spann, the guy that would go on to knock out Dominic Reyes inside of 90 seconds just 2 years later, and submit Ion Cutelaba in the first half of the first round, just an appearance prior to that. This is a guy that can finish bodies that are preparing to wash out. We saw him do it to Misha Serkinov in 2021, and we've seen how Serkinov has fallen out since. Ankalaev was a total mismatch for him and washed him pretty badly. Injured him badly enough in a way that he needed to get surgery afterwards. He comes back. He's shown mercy from Walker. He goes to the distance, I believe, for only the sixth time in like over 50 MMA fights. But he takes a lot of damage and shows some like alarming red flags, as I talked to about that "you're hurting my family" comment or whatever he said to Johnny Walker, and Walker's just like, bro, what the fuck are you talking about? So he doesn't have it anymore, man, but I wonder if he knows that he doesn't have it anymore and he's just kind of not willing to let it go. And I wonder if the UFC gave him this because these guys have bad blood that they demonstrated after the Spann loss, that Spann is like, oh, I can get it back on this dude. And Smith needs this as like his kind of edge. But I think the reality is going to hit him. And when it does, I think he's going to settle into his role in the booth, which is what the UFC wants, which is why they're giving him this fight, this rematch that none of the fans are asking for. Spann and Smith probably asked for it themselves, but nobody else really needs to see this fight again, especially because we know what Smith is relative to his last two performances at this point, and how it will be more difficult for him to capitalize on a mistake from Spann now than it was 2 years ago when he was understandably less sharp and has presumably been in a more prepared position to succeed with Fortis MMA now than he was coming out of the pandemic. So I am really considering making Spann a leg here this week, although I recognize how much risk is involved in that. But I just think the fade is so obvious on Smith based on what we've seen in the last two fights. I just don't know if you're going to get another opportunity to play him like this again. It's possible if he gets finished in the first round by Spann, that might be devastating enough for Smith that he just is done after this. I hope that isn't the circumstances under which his career ends, but this guy has so much mileage at this point, and his body has just been through it so much, and he has such a good gig waiting for him that it's like, at what point, how much is your pride really worth it? This could be a pride-shattering moment for Anthony Smith. And I know for a lot of longtime fans, that could be devastating, but, I mean, you see pride shattered all the time in the sport to the tune of easy money. And that's kind of what I think I'm looking at here. So if I'm wrong and Smith is able to salvage his career and get another run at the light heavyweight crown, more power to the guy. Let's have him fight Yalton Almeida next and see how that goes if we want to keep throwing top 10 opponents Mr. Smith's way at this stage of his career as he's staring down, 35 years old? Either way, you got to go with Spann here. So give me Spann to win. And now we come to the main event. Max Holloway in the Korean Zombie. Okay, so as I said in the pre-fight, or in the beginning of the show, which is easily the longest one I've ever done at this point, there's not much that needs to be said here relative to betting. You can't bet an 800 favorite. It's stupid. Just don't do it. If Holloway somehow gets memed, he's been finished once before, but it was by submission by Poirier in his UFC debut. Holloway's UFC debut, that is. I didn't think it was out of the question that Chan Sung Jung could KO Volkanovski, and that was a very stupid assumption by me in the infancy of my analyzing this sport last year. It was just kind of a vengeful, I wouldn't say vengeful, but an emotional hedge against, not even a hedge, just me hoping for a result that wasn't going to happen. And Volkanovski, in fact, turned the tables entirely on Korean Zombie in a way that I thought TKZ would at least survive the decision, but Chan Sung Jung had other plans and showed he is, in fact, both mortal and very much alive. So, unfortunately, I think that this fight is going to play out in pretty similar fashion to how Korean Zombie's last one did. So thankfully, the plus 2.5 rounds is available at, I believe, minus 245, 65 range. And I would think about making that a leg, but I really just want to leave this fight alone and enjoy it as a fan as much as possible. I will say to the effect of that overcashing, I'm looking at the results for Holloway's career right now, and I am seeing that of all of his UFC appearances, of which there are 27, only 5 of them didn't go past 2.5 rounds. And those were all prior to 2015. The last time Holloway ended a fight in the first round was when he fought Charles Oliveira and knocked him out. Every other appearance since then, including all of his main events, have gone 5 rounds. That includes a couple of appearances even before then that went to 3-round decisions against Ricardo Llamas and and Jeremy Stevens. Even all of his losses, short of the Poirier submission, have gone to decision in his MMA career. So it's this guy, even if he's leading the dance, he's proven usually what the rhythm of his fight is going to be. I don't really see any reason different why against a guy in Korean Zombie who has a lot of flash KO success, but otherwise has mostly proven in even these main event fights to drag things out, as he did with Dan Ige and Volkanovski and Brian Ortega and even Yair Rodriguez. I mean, these are all very, very still high-level proven names even today. You know, in the case of the Rodriguez result, it's incredible that happened 5 years ago we're coming up on. But he's a guy that even in the instances where he's been finished, like even the Aldo fight as an example, he's a guy that he will endure and usually get finished late. So I think the 2.5 is a bit of grace here. I would be way more nervous about a 3.5, but I feel good about this one going 3 rounds in a way where Holloway mitigates the early power threat from the Korean Zombie to ensure, because the most finishes statistically happen in the first round and are less likely to happen as the fight wears on. Holloway gradually turns the volume up in a way where he's, painting Zombie with damage, albeit not necessarily in the lights out manner that we may be accustomed to seeing. But Holloway ultimately does enough damage over 10 minutes where getting into the final 10 minutes of the fight, we're looking at another potential stoppage situation where Zombie's too tough for his own good. I think McClatchy Picks put out a really, really nice prop that was in like the plus 200 range for like Max Holloway to win by knockout in round 3, 4, or 5. Obviously, I would be hoping it doesn't happen in round 3, but I think that's like one of the best props of the year, to be honest. I would not expect Zombie to survive to a decision. The UFC's already proven that they'll basically throw in the towel for him if they need to and stop him on his feet. You could very, very easily see that happening after about 10 minutes of eating too much volume from Max Holloway. So I'm taking the plus 2.5. What I want to quickly touch on here is, just I spoke about Volkanovski a bit, and it's interesting. Like, I remember during COVID, the first major title fight I tuned into was like a casual trying to get back into the sport while there wasn't really any other sports on, was when Volkanovski fought Max Holloway for the first time, I believe. And it was, it's fascinating how I have kind of done a 180 on what my opinion of Volkanovski was, because going back to that first result, it was actually the second time they fought. But the second time they fought, I had the perception that, he's a leg kick cheeser, and then he won on a split decision, and everybody wanted Holloway to win, so they were all very upset about that. So it was interesting, carrying that opinion over from him from that result against when he fought Korean Zombie last year, and I had my judgment so heavily colored in favor of wanting Korean Zombie to win, and having to really learn how neutral I have to be in my analysis for this from that experience, in which I just wanted to will something to happen, and you just can't do that when you're putting a financial stake in these things. So I learned a valuable lesson that night about not, betting with your heart, and really just embracing what reality is telling you versus the narrative that you would like to see unfold, and say, I bet on it because I willed it to happen. If the path isn't there, you just can't take it. It's a lesson we all have to learn, fellas. Anyway, I bring up Volkanovski because of the parallel with Zombie in terms of learning, how my judgment of these characters has evolved. I still haven't bet a Holloway money line in any of his events. I've always hedged on rounds in all of the cases in which he's fought since I started doing this. I'm going to have to do it again here because the value just isn't there for what it is. But we complain about some of these cards. I think this is a great card, personally. I'm always a fan of the road shows. I think this is a better main event that it's being given credit for, and I'm concerned that the betting line, because it's perceived to be such a blowout, is kind of taking away from what really should be a special event, because these are two guys that their contribution to the sport over the last decade from a promotional standpoint it's just indisputable. It was 10 years ago this month that Chan Sung Jung fought for the UFC title against Jose Aldo and came up short, and then had to put his career on pause to go do his military service in South Korea. And then he comes back He knocks out Dennis Bermudez. He gets reverse elbowed against Yair Rodriguez in a fight he was literally about to win in the last moment. And that kind of sabotages his comeback story. And you wonder at that point, does this guy really, still have it after so much time away and getting put out in such spectacular fashion like that after other knockout instances in the past? Is he really going to be able to ascend to primetime status again? And then the Moicano fight happens. And, man, I cry watching this sport more than anybody. That fight, when I taped it for Moicano and Zombie purposes, I mean, when they're chanting his name and the chants just go out and then he just drops Moicano and the crowd goes nuts. You see people like delirious in the stands afterwards after he wins. And you have to understand why. He gets a first minute finish in a main headline pay-per-view like that in South Carolina, of all places. Not even Asia, where his image has to be even loftier than it is in the United States. I mean, you saw like Korean women crying in the stands in South Carolina when he won. I mean, you can't imagine what Chan Sung Jung has done for this sport globally. And now he gets to fight Max Holloway, who prior to Volkanovski was on his way to being on the Mount Rushmore of the UFC, who is understandably, justifiably an 800 favorite in this main event, as he prepares to fight on the other side of the world, coming off of previously headlining another main event in April against Arnold Allen in Kansas City. This is a man of the world and a man of the sport in Max Holloway. Where do you think that guy's heart is right now? We all know what's going on in Hawaii. This fight was supposed to be Chan Sung Jung's retirement fight, and it has become something so much more than that for such a horrible reason because of what has happened within the same, only an ocean, not even a full ocean away, on another set of Pacific Islands. You could probably take some boat out of Singapore directly to Maui, I would guess. I can't even imagine where that guy's heart and head is right now going into this fight. I think everybody in that state is going to be watching Holloway on Saturday. How do you root against either of these guys? It's impossible. So that's not the only reason I'm hedging on rounds, because I don't want to choose between the two of them, and the value on Holloway is just completely ridiculous. But my God, how do you root for one of these men to lose in this case? I really don't care what happens. My heart goes out to both of them. It's unbelievable. The array of emotions that get displayed in that cage, in that octagon. I think we're in for an emotional fight. I think that you're going to see both of these guys with full hearts in the circumstances that they find themselves in. Chan Sung Jung fighting at what might be the last appearance in his career in his home continent, taking on another champion of the Pacific who is fighting with what has to be one of the fullest hearts imaginable in wake of the tragedy that has just unfolded. I think that we've got a sleeper candidate for fight of the year. I don't expect it to be super, super competitive in the way that we expect Holloway to lose at some point. But I do think that Chan Sung Jung is going to have moments of success that make people believe that, you know, there's still a potential for something to get done here. I think we probably end up seeing something like a 50-45 from Holloway. It's possible that Chan Sung Jung gets finished late, but this is a guy that has the reputation for getting into wars. We know Holloway makes everything a war, and we know these guys are both fighting with really full hearts. And my heart goes out to them too. So I've made my piece known. I held it together, thankfully. I did get a little bit emotional talking about what I expect to be an emotional fight, but you know what? I've put too much fucking time into this to not have some kind of vested interest in these characters, especially the ones that have made contributions to this thing that we all love so much. Give them their roses before they're gone. That's what I'm doing before I assume TKZ is going to retire after this. Because even though I missed the boat on both of these guys' careers because I fell out of love with this sport after like 2010 and didn't come back until last year, I recognize what these guys have done. And I'm going to put it on the record how I feel about both of them. So thank you, Max Holloway. Thank you, Korean Zombie. I wish you all the best, Chan Sung Jung. If you do find a finish, I hope it is past the third round. And the same goes to you, Mr. Max. So give me the plus 2.5 rounds. Give me Holloway to win. I'm not going to be rooting for either one of these guys. I just hope that we get a result, a fight that both of them can be proud of, given where the world is at for each of them. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD this week. Wow, we went over 2 hours, but it's come on. It's 10 fights, 11. I got 11 fights to get through with 10 picks and a no call on a Song Kenan showdown. It's a lot to get through. If you did listen to all 2 hours that I just ranted into the microphone and ate presumably expired Taco Bell, which I'm not going to recommend from a health perspective, but I'm not going to recommend betting on the Professional Fight League or whatever it's called either. Listen, thank you very much for listening to my enlightened opinion, as I just alluded to. And we'll be back next week for, is it UFC Paris? I believe it is. The return to Paris, almost a year on the dot, I believe, from a calendar perspective. And it is going to be Cyril Gane versus Sergey Spivak. Which is lined a bit more closer than I think people would expect. Some big names on the card for this one, so going to be fascinating. Look forward to diving into it. Looks like quite a healthy stack of prelim fights as well, so definitely going to have an assortment of picks to get through. More than a few debutants, so maybe not as many as I'm expecting at the moment, but we'll look at it in due time. And we got another event in Singapore, a continent away, to get through this weekend, so I'll be up bright and early for this event, and no bachelor party in the way this week, so you know I'm going to be live tweeting these picks, especially after all the success we had last week. But we'll be seeing if we can crack 300 units for the year. That'll be the next goal in light of, or not 300 units for the year, but 300 since UFC Charlotte. It's up 272, 273, I believe, since UFC Jacksonville now, so we'll see for each of those streaks if we can get above the 300 threshold before the end of the year. But I want to thank you for tuning in to the MMA RAXPOD once again, and we will be back next week for UFC Paris. So take care, folks. Hit like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and on YouTube, and I look forward to giving you more MMA goodness through the audio waves. Thank you very much.